Good morning, or whenever it is that you're watching this. Welcome back. Time for Unit 9.3, Origin of the Civil Rights Movement. Now, mostly in this unit, we're going to talk about the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, but this time I want to kind of rewind a little bit and sort of remind us how we got here, what's been done so far, what work is still left to do, and some of the names and people that are going to show up during this time period, including Rosa Parks right there, getting arrested for, sitting down on a bus. So, if we want to figure out where segregation came from, if we want to figure out where this really big goal of the civil rights movement of the 1960s and 1970s to sort of get rid of segregation came from, it originally came from slavery. Before America was even a country, we were a big part of the slave trade, part of the African slave trade. After slavery, after the Civil War, and the Emancipation Proclamation and the ratification of the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments, a lot of southern states and northern states, all the states really came up with, most famously in the South, but there were certainly issues in the North. You have what were called Jim Crow laws, because 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment says we can't have slavery anymore, and you can't specifically have a law that says white people get this and black people get that. But you can find other ways to make it work, right? So the little cartoon here shows a train car for white folks and a Jim Crow car, separate, not being equal, obviously. Speaking of separate but equal, the Plessy versus Ferguson Supreme Court decision in 1896. We talked about this back when it happened in class, of course, but a quick reminder. This is the Supreme Court case that allowed states to segregate their schools. Now, states had been doing this. They got sued, Plessy versus Ferguson, and the Supreme Court said, no, it is okay to have a white school and a black school, and like we've talked about with Lyndon B. Johnson in his past, Mexican-American schools, Hispanic people is who went there. And then on the West Coast, they would have, Asian schools just for Asian kids, that kind of a thing. So separate but equal. Black students can be forced to go to all black schools, or Hispanic kids, or Asian kids, or Native American kids. But the states must maintain those schools as equal to the white schools. Now that, of course, never happened. I've not been able to find one example of a black school or Hispanic school for Hispanic kids, Native American kids, Asian kids, that was the equal of the white school that was nearby. Because that was the whole point, was to make a better experience for the white kids than the black kids. Because of, the idea that white kids were worth more. Obviously, that's not the kids' fault. That's definitely the fault of the parents, of the politicians, of the judges that made those decisions. But that's why that decision was made. So, fast forwarding a little bit in time, 1947, Jackie Robinson breaks the color barrier in baseball. We'll talk about more about that in a couple of days, actually. 1948, the next year, President Truman integrates the military. No more separate black units and white units. Integration. And that becomes a huge, huge thing, because imagine going to war and you're put in a unit with various ethnicities, and you come back from the war and you want to go, spend time with your buddies, and all of a sudden the law says they can't go to the same restaurant as you, they can't go to the same movie theater as you. It's like, they saved your life in a war. They get to go anywhere you get to go. So, there's definitely folks in the military, not officially as part of their, military jobs, but definitely some of the civil rights activists we see in the 50s, 60s, and 70s are former military that came up in integrated units. Now, as of 1948, there's still a bunch of Jim Crow laws around. Some of them have been gotten rid of. Some of them have sort of, kind of fallen off to the wayside, but a lot of them are still around. You've got poll taxes and literacy tests to stop minorities from voting. And of course, school segregation is still 100% legal at this point. We have the Great Migration. Now this happens World War I, Great Depression, World War II is the big move. But I mean, this happens sort of throughout that whole world at war time period. That many African Americans start moving north during the wars, looking for new jobs, new opportunities, and not everyone in the north wanted them there. A lot of people in the north didn't want them there. This sign is, I believe, right outside the city of Detroit. That gives you an idea of what people thought back then. Now, African Americans went anyway. They were able to put down roots. Obviously, Detroit. A lot of black people live in Detroit, Chicago, New York. A lot of these big cities get Milwaukee. A lot of these big cities get much bigger minority populations during this time period, and this introduces African Americans into a lot of these areas, but specifically into the northern half of the Democratic Party. And now the southern part of the Democratic Party is still very anti-civil rights, but the northern half of the party starts kind of getting involved very slowly in civil rights and stuff like that, because, hey, more people to vote for them. So desegregating schools, big part of this. Brown v. Board of Education is the sort of anti-Plessy versus Ferguson. Remember 1896, Plessy v. Ferguson says schools are separate but equal. You can have a black school, you can have a white school. 1954, the NAACP, remember, founded by W.E.B. Du Bois. I think I.D.B. Wells was in on that. A lot of the people we talked about in the 1910s and 1920s civil rights era began the NAACP. Here they are 40 years later, arguing that Plessy versus Ferguson has to be overturned. We have to get rid of that. Separate cannot be equal. Specifically, it violated the 14th Amendment rights of minorities, equal protection of the laws, and Chief Justice Earl Warren wrote, "Separate facilities are inherently unequal." And the Supreme Court was unanimous and ordered that schools must be integrated with all deliberate speed. Not everybody does it with all deliberate speed. And that, this is not Earl Warren, this is Justice, it's the first black Supreme Court justice. What was his name? He's on the Warren Court. Hold on. Sorry. I need to remember this. This is not a good blank to be having. Thurgood Marshall. Jeez Louise. Sorry. Thurgood Marshall, the very first African American Supreme Court justice, was in on this case, and he was asked more than once if he should be allowed to judge on this case. And a lot of the civil rights cases during this time period, because he was black and therefore he might be biased. Well, what about all the white Supreme Court justices that might be biased about civil rights? Anyway, Supreme Court does a good thing here. They recognize that Plessy versus Ferguson was incorrectly decided, that having segregated schools absolutely violates the 14th Amendment rights of students everywhere in the country, and that separate facilities would inherently be unequal. Good job, Supreme Court. And there are plenty of schools that integrate pretty quickly, but a lot of them don't. So this is one of the signs that I could find without one of the pictures with people holding signs protesting this that didn't have, the actual N-word on it. So we went with this picture. White schools did not integrate with all deliberate speed, not in the South and not in the North. A lot of states closed their public schools and then opened what they called private, yet state-funded schools for white students only. And if it was not technically a state school, well, technically they didn't have to follow the rules under Brown v. Board of Education. or they started what they called independent school districts, not run by the state, not run by the county, but run by themselves, that might technically be able to avoid the whole integration thing for a few more years, at least while they tie that up in court some more. Once again, the KKK sets out murdering black people and burning crosses on lawns and trying to kick black people out of neighborhoods. Because what else are they going to do? Learn something, grow as individuals, try and accept that we're all human beings. Anyway, they should. That'd be great. That'd be wonderful. The KKK could just stop doing all that nonsense they're doing and understand that we all work better together. Moving on. Another education incident we have is in 1956. Now remember, 1954, NAACP says you have to get your schools desegregated. You have to integrate with all deliberate speed. 1956, 2 years later, Little Rock Central High School, Little Rock, Arkansas, is ordered by a federal court to enroll these 9 black students. They had been not integrating at all over these last 2 years. Now, Governor Orville Faubus orders the Arkansas National Guard to block the entrance to the school, literally calls in the military to stop black kids from getting able to go to this white school that the federal court had said you must allow them to do. So President Eisenhower, Ike, not huge on civil rights, he wasn't Woodrow Wilson, okay? Remember, Woodrow Wilson helped get the KKK going again in the 1910s and 1920s? Not 1920s, 1910s. But President Eisenhower wasn't big on civil rights like some of the other presidents and some of the other people that we've had since. He did take offense to this, though, because he was a big federal government is in charge kind of guy, especially of the military. So because the Arkansas governor activated the National Guard, President Eisenhower used his role as the commander-in-chief to order the Arkansas National Guard to stand down and sent in federal troops to walk the students in every single day. I think we'll see some pictures, some more pictures of the crowds that gathered out to keep these kids out. And it was the Little Rock 9, but I think one of them got suspended and expelled within the first week for not doing anything wrong. They just found an excuse to do it, and they were trying to get the rest of the 8 of them during their time in school. A few years later, 1960, we have Ruby Bridges, the very first black student at William Frantz Elementary School in New Orleans. She had to be escorted by federal marshals every single day to school, and parents pulled their students from the school. Some parents kept their kids in the school, but wouldn't let them be in the same class as her. And only one teacher in the school actually agreed to teach Ruby. So she would go to school, protected by federal marshals, while people were throwing things at her and screaming things at her, including a whole bunch of racial slurs. This is a painting, by the way, from Norman Rockwell. You might have seen him. We talked about his paintings in under FDR with the freedom from want, the freedom from fear, those posters. So very sort of patriotic, middle America, goody two-shoes kind of painter. He had to paint this because he felt that what she was doing was good, what these federal marshals were doing was good, and what the people protesting against her was bad, which, he was right. So she goes to school. Jeez, that'll be fun looking at the audio transfer there, my bad. We live near an airstrip, what can I say? Well, I don't live here, but it feels like that sometimes. So she would go to school, go to this one teacher's classroom, stay in the classroom all day while this one teacher taught her. None of the other kids would go near her. None of the other teachers would go near her. And if she got to go out and play at recess one day, it would just be with that one teacher. And that one teacher got death threats and, threatened to be run out of town. And I'm sure, I don't know if she I don't know if she ever got a cross burned on her lawn by the KKK, but I know she got some messages sent to her by them. And this is Ruby Bridges. I mean, not today, but this is a picture from her Twitter account. So not too long ago. She does have a Twitter account. You can find her at Ruby Bridges on Twitter. And she's still doing civil rights activist stuff. So remember when I said, like, this isn't that long ago, and, like, the history we're talking about is basically modern day? Here you go. This is her during the time period we're talking about. A painting, not a photograph, obviously. This is her today. You can go on Twitter and say, we learned about you in class today. So, there are some victories, there are some defeats. This is a picture of one of the lunch counter protests. We'll talk a little more detail about them. But basically, a lot of restaurants, even though they were technically not supposed to be segregating, did. And so these kids would go in and sit down at the counter together and order a drink. It was black kids, but it was also white kids going in with them. Teenagers, college students. And, you know, there was violence. People would try and beat them up and drag them off the stools and pour, you know, milkshakes and drinks and soda on their heads to try and get them to leave. Because they had been taught that we'll keep the races separate for whatever reason. So let's talk about some of these victories, some of these defeats. The Montgomery bus boycott, 1955, Montgomery, Alabama. This is one of the turning points in the civil rights fight. So Rosa Parks is asked to move from her seat in a bus. She refuses. She gets arrested. This was all planned in advance. This wasn't just her deciding one day, like, I don't feel like getting up. There was a reporter there to cover it. She had, talked this out with other civil rights people. Like, this was a plan. This was planned. And civil rights leaders in the South, mostly in Montgomery, but all throughout the South, organizes a boycott of the busing system by all African Americans for over a year. And these guys didn't have cars and they just felt like taking the bus. If they worked 5 miles away, they walked 5 miles there, 5 miles back every day for over a year. And eventually the bus system caved because, like, it turns out the majority of their money came from black people. So when the bus companies relented and said, okay, black people can sit wherever they want, then black people started riding the bus again. We get the rise of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. One of the leaders of the Montgomery boycott was a 26-year-old Martin Luther King Jr. 26. Now you might think, well, that's old. People in their 20s are old. Try and remember this when you hit 26 years old. Whatever you're doing when you're 26 years old, this is when Martin Luther King Jr. stepped up into the national spotlight and became who he was for the next roughly decade. And he forms the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the Student Nonviolence Coordinating Committee. We'll talk more about those groups as we get to them. And their big thing was nonviolent protest and civil disobedience. When you see the name Martin Luther King Jr., you should be thinking nonviolent civil disobedience. I see that in some way, shape, or form on the STAR test every year. So we talked about some sit-ins at restaurants, but they also did hotels, they did buildings, they did libraries, they did pools. We'll see something about pools. So obviously, I don't know about showing a YouTube video on a YouTube video, but there's a link in your notes to this. We'll take a look at it in class. But Mr. Rogers invites the black police officer of Mr. Rogers' neighborhood to come and put their feet in a pool together. Very political. Very political. On purpose. Way to go, Mr. Rogers. And we will also see the first interracial kiss on television was Captain Kirk and Lieutenant Uhura on Star Trek. And they had to fight very hard to make that happen. They did that very much on purpose. Very political statement from Star Trek. So we're getting close to the end, but I do have to give you a warning here. This next slide here, not great. There is a racial slur on this. Well, not the next slide, but the slide coming up, there is a racial slur, but it's the name of an actual government program that I have to teach you about, so I can't teach you about it without using the word. Thankfully, it's not the N-word, but it's not a great one. So we're not using this name in class. This isn't the time to joke about it. When we talk about this in class, we're not doing jokes, and I'll give this fair warning again when we talk about it like in class, discuss it in class. We're not using racial slurs in classroom, not as a joke, not as anything other than describing the context of the situation. And even then, we're gonna do our best not to. So we're not using the racist term, other than to name it this one time. So immigration issues, we've got some victories here in the immigration issue. A lot of bans on Chinese and other Asian immigrants were lifted. Remember the Chinese Exclusion Act, the different quota acts. A lot of these get lifted, a lot of these get sort of tossed away, and we get a bunch more immigrants from Asia into America. And the bad, we get a bunch of new laws trying to reduce immigration from Mexico. Before this, we pretty much had an open border with Mexico. If you wanted to, if you wanted to travel down and visit Mexico, you just pop down there and pop back. If a guy from Mexico wanted to come up and work on a farm for a few months, he could just head up, work on the farm for a few months, get his pay, and head back to Mexico. But now there are a bunch of laws that try and reduce immigration and reduce people just walking over the border. And in the early 1950s, the U.S. Government began Operation Wetback. That's the official name. Yes, it's racist. Deported about 3.8 million Mexicans to Mexico. Around 60% of those people were actually native-born American citizens. If that sounds familiar, it's because they did it during the Great Depression. We called it repatriation then, remember? At least we didn't use racial slur to do it that time. I don't know. But again, about both times, about 60%, 70% of the people that we deported back to Mexico were actually U.S. citizens. And this was done because some white voters were concerned that Mexicans were stealing their jobs, which was the exact concern during the Great Depression. Next time on U.S. history, John F. Kennedy's been assassinated. By some of the stuff, Malcolm X is going to get assassinated next, technically, but, yeah. Anyway. And as always, if you need the sources and the citations and such, you can find them on your notes. So let's, we'll see you tomorrow. Take care.